and which traces the establishment of Islam in the Americas over the past 3 centuries, specifically focusing on Muslims' lived experiences and the numerous ways Islam has been shaped in the Muslim minority contexts of the New World. Today, we are fortunate to have such an illustrious guest amongst us, not only because of her vast and rigorous work, but also because of the lucid and critical ways in which she challenges the typical view of Islam as timeless, predictable, and opposed to Western worldviews and value systems. At this time, when superiority-infused phobias are globally resounding, typecasting, excluding, injuring, and killing, it is all the more important to insist in the creation of problematizing and thus liberative knowledge. In this, Aisha, your work is valuable. Without further dilation, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Aisha Khan.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great privilege to be invited to speak with you today, and I really thank you so much for being here. It's a real joy for me to have you here to share with me in some, I think, important discussions that we all engage in one way or another. I would like to thank Humberto Garcia Muniz and everyone else who has worked so hard to make such a wonderful lecture series, and also to Juan Caraballo Resto, whom I am honored and grateful to be in conversation with today. However, I have to say that I'm also very sad that this conversation is taking place only a few days after a mass killing of Muslims, this time in New Zealand. These kinds of incidents make it all the more important that we make efforts, like we're all doing here today, to get to know and understand one another better. I think that should be the goal of much of our, if not all of our scholarship. Not the only goal, but a primary one for sure. I also want to thank you for putting, I'm ashamed that, the old saying, use it or lose it. I did do 5 months of ethnographic field research in Honduras where no one spoke a word of English. They actually still spoke a lot of Garifuna, and my Spanish was pretty good then, but that was a long time ago. And so I thank you very much for indulging me today. You're all very comfortable with many languages, and I appreciate your patience with me. Now, let me start out by saying I want to make a couple of general points and then a couple of interesting ambiguities that I would like to draw your attention to, and then a couple of case studies today. I apologize, I forgot to thank Juan for, I think, the best introduction I ever got. So I was just lost in thinking, how wonderful that person is that he's talking about. Who is that? So thank you very much for that. Now, when we think about Muslims and Islam in the Caribbean, we basically have 2 frames of reference, 2 general frames of reference. Scholarly work on Muslims in the Americas today, scholarly work, generally is celebratory, often focusing on tallies of the numerous notable Muslims that have contributed to the history of this part of the world. There is still far too little study of this kind, but historians, literary scholars, and others have produced important portraits of Muslims in the Americas, free, enslaved, and indentured. Interestingly, in historical contexts, these figures largely are praised for their role in resistance against colonialism, specifically as leaders of slave rebellions. Among the most famous, for example, is the Muslim slave rebellion in Bahia, Brazil, in 1835, which the historian João José Reis, who literally wrote the book on it, describes as, quote, the most important urban slave rebellion in the Americas and the only one in which Islam played a major role, end quote. There is also another very important and celebrated figure in connection with Islam and resistance in the Americas. And even if he is more apocryphal than actual, and there are differing opinions on this, and that is Boukman Dutty, leader of the Haitian Revolution, who I will return to momentarily. But on the other hand, in contrast with this largely celebratory treatment of Muslims in the Americas historically, in much of the popular media today, the image of this historic resistance is subject to another interpretation, shared, perhaps not surprisingly, by former colonial authorities throughout the Americas. In other words, there's some continuity here. Muslims are treated as the proverbial fifth column or inside agitators or invading foreign terrorists, whether it's post 9/11 discourse circulating in the US or alleged ISIS volunteers hailing from Canada and Trinidad. So it's no wonder that our knowledge and understanding of Muslims and Islam in the hemisphere is quite limited. In terms of quantity, that is, we don't know very much, even when the narrative is a positive one. We need a lot more study. And also in terms of quality, that is, we more or less have to choose between good Muslim and bad Muslim, to borrow from the title of political historian Mahmoud Mamdani's book on the subject. What I would like us to do today is to step out of that dual opposite model, which doesn't leave much room for appreciating complexity, and to think about Muslims and Islam in terms that are neither value judgments nor minimal reductions into either or. A good place to start this revisioning is to approach Islam in its vernacular. By this I mean the particular expressions of Islam that Muslims in different historical, social, and cultural contexts develop and practice according to those contexts. This is where a singular Islam with a capital I is put to the test, so to speak, in the sense of the relationship between what some might call orthodoxy or standard doctrine and heterodoxy, that is, diverse variations of doctrine. Too often, I think, we in the West, with our still operating colonial gaze, it's unfortunately still alive and well, and our present-day worries, our geopolitical worries, we miss the different ways that Muslims are Muslims, and therefore the different ways that Islam is of the Caribbean and the West more broadly, as well as in it. And I think these two words are very, very significant and convey very different messages of and in. These issues are not simply academic, for they have global and local policy implications for the ways societies are organized and the ways that the rights of others, of the members of the society, are protected. Now, protect can mean different things as can member of a society. And we'll see this in a little bit, how semantics makes a very big difference here. When we only know a religion, any religion, as a supposedly unchanging and uncompromising set of sacred or spiritual requirements, and the people who practice them as not worth learning more about because we think we already know them through these characterizations or stereotypes, and as a consequence, fear or disapprove of them, then we are not likely to understand them or ourselves better, which hinders our efforts to make a better, more fair, and open-minded world for everyone. Now, although no Caribbean country has a Muslim majority population, Islam has been an important presence in the region for at least 5 centuries. Islam's Caribbean journeys began with Muslim explorers, captives, and emigrants who hailed from diverse societies and cultures around the globe and who have been devotees of varying schools of Islamic thought for generations. Historically in the Americas, these societies and cultures were concentrated in primarily 2 places, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Today, Islam's Caribbean journeys continue as regional inhabitants convert or return, as many would phrase it, to Islam, and as Muslim immigrants arrive from locations as diverse as in the past. In this presentation today, I want to touch on examples of Muslims living in different countries and localities in the Caribbean as I explore the ways that Islam can and should, I think, be understood as a local rather than foreign tradition in this region. And again, with local taking on all of the different complexity that context gives it. For starters, we need to know how the terms Muslim and Islam are interpreted across time and geography. Although today we will see a diverse range of representations, a significant influence in the ways that the Americas, including the Caribbean, envisions Muslims and Islam is the view of the world that was held by 17th through early 19th century Europe's Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers. In other words, I'm referring to a long legacy of, one might say, a long epistemological legacy, a legacy of ways of thinking about the other. This is not to say that Old World Christians and Muslims were not aware of each other before this time, that is the 17th through 19th century. Of course they were. For example, England had long-term relationships with the Muslim world, at least since Elizabeth I was building new alliances with the rulers of Morocco, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire in order to, in England's battles with the Spanish and the French and every other enemy they had on the continent. The Oxford English Dictionary first includes the term Muslim in 1615, defining it simply as a person who, quote, is instructed in the beliefs of the Mohammedans, end quote. 10 years later, in 1625, the word Islam first appears in English in the comments of a travel writer, Samuel Purchas, who quoted a Javanese prince as saying that the religion of Islam doth not agree with the Christian religion, end quote. But Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers inherited many of the impressions and presumptions held by Europe centuries earlier. And so I was just giving you a couple of centuries even preceding in the Enlightenment to tell you that these are long-held ideas that are tenacious and yet do alter according to changing moments and places. Most Enlightenment scholars and post-Enlightenment thinkers philosophized about, among other things, human cultural evolution and the ranked human racial types that proved and justified their ideas. A number of these types hailed from the New World, right? We all recognize the quote-unquote noble savage of the Americas, as well as the Old World of Africa and Asia. These thinkers' ideas served as frameworks through which non-European Christian others were evaluated, which was virtually always as inferior because the supposed stages of human development reflected a hierarchical progression from lowest human to, no surprise, Euro-Christians, of course. When Muslim figured as a distinct category in these developmental models, it carried traces of older ways of thinking that continued to shape images of Muslims down through the centuries. But But even though the highest point of human development was thought to include only Euro-Christianity in these ways of thinking in Europe, in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment and pre-periods, other categorical types of people were not necessarily clear-cut. For example, George Hegel, who was a post-Enlightenment thinker, very famous, you all know who he is, who wrote in the early 1800s, looked at what he called Mohammedanism, which was the common term at the time, and he said that Mohammedanism seemed to be the only thing that, quote, brought all the Negroes at all nearer to culture, end quote. Only in the north of Africa, he said, quote, where the Moors have propagated the Muslim faith, have Africans become less barbarous, end quote. Now remember, his language is the racist language of 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century Europe and its philosophers. But it's very interesting. I'm not just drawing attention to Enlightenment bias, but because that's there, and that's really important to know, especially as it's a legacy today. But I'm also pointing out that there's a kind of ambivalence here about Islam. So not being a threat to the quote-unquote true religion, which is what it was called, of Christianity, Hegel apparently saw Islam as having something to teach those others occupying developmental stages below. He judged Moors, whom he seems to consider the originators of Islam, to be located higher up the human developmental hierarchy than Africans, or as they would have been called at that time, Negroes. We see this view in British colonial documents 100 years later, where officials and owners of enslaved Africans would occasionally comment on the superiority of their Muslim African slaves, especially that they were literate or presumed to be literate, which many certainly were. But I think it's quite interesting that what happens with the idea of a Muslim person in this particular context of African slavery in the New World. Colonizers and slave owners from other European countries besides Britain are known to sometimes have held similar opinions about Muslim Africans. In other words, that they were kind of a step higher than non-Muslim Africans. In this view, Muslims both proved Africans' inferiority and proved European superiority, proved in the sense of this ideology. In this point of view, on the part of these thinkers, African Muslims are doing two different things. They're proving the inferiority of non-Muslim Africans, but proving still the superiority of European Christians. So let's still continue with the context in terms and what how important those are. Islam's relationship with Europe began even before Christopher Columbus, Hernan Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and other explorers, including the Portuguese, arrived in the Americas, along with their crews of mariners who included Iberian and North African Muslims. The Spanish in particular had a broad range of acquaintance with Islam, involving almost 8 centuries of Iberian, North African, and sub-Saharan contact and interdependence. They brought some of these ways of knowing Islam with them to the New World. The Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519 and referred to the Aztecs he encountered as Moors. And one priest in Cortés's party said that the indigenous peoples of northern Mexico reminded him of Al-Arabes, or Arabs. Spaniards called Aztec and Inca temples mosques, and drew parallels between some Andean and Islamic rituals that involved animal sacrifice. Don Pietro Alonso Nino, the commander of the Santa Maria, which you will remember was one of Columbus's 3 ships, is thought to be descended from Muslims residing in Granada. But by 1539, Charles V of Spain decreed that no descendants of Muslims were to be allowed into the West Indies, and in 1543, he decreed that Muslims who were already in the Spanish colonies were to be expelled. Spanish administrators had been complaining that Muslims were teaching, quote, bad manners to the, meaning resistance and refusal, right? They weren't talking about where to put your napkin, right? Teaching bad manners to the indigenous populations, or those that were still left, and inciting rebellions. These are more examples of a different kind of the diverse ways that Muslims and Islam can be interpreted and have been interpreted in this part of the world and passed down for generations as accurate, common sense representations. In other words, there are many ways to know Muslims. Now let me spend the rest of my time with you discussing two cases in point in particular. And my point with these is to explore the various kinds of vernaculars that define and identify Islam and Muslims. So the first one, well, before we get there, let me just have a little preface here. It's estimated that that of the 12 million or so Africans enslaved in the Americas, at least 10% were Muslims. That's the estimate. The histories of Muslims of African descent in the Caribbean are complex, as we've just seen, not the least reason being the question of how the definitional boundaries around Muslim and Islam are retained in diaspora and through creolization. Given the Caribbean's foundational history of slavery and indenture, African slavery, Indian indenture, Muslims are generally studied in academic scholarship as being either African or Indian, that is from India, and then the research usually takes over from there. But the premise begins already with this kind of pretty tidy distinction. And the idea is that these Africans and Indian Muslims whose religious beliefs and practices are characterized by different cultural influences, as I said. So there's the idea that there's already these tidy boundaries. Slavery and indenture were the two principal ways that Muslims came to the Americas, as slaves or as so-called coolies, as indentured Indian immigrants were known. This historical and demographic division between Muslims' origins is accurate. There was a thing called slavery that enslaved African peoples. There was a thing called indenture that came after slavery was abolished that brought Indians from Britain's other colony, that is India, to the Caribbean to continue work on the sugar plantations. So all of that is true. There were these historical and demographic divisions are accurate, but they're often treated as creating much more tidy boundaries around Africans' Islam and Indians' Islam than is the case in everyday life. Even among Afro-Caribbean peoples and among Indo-Caribbean peoples, definitions and interpretations can be more ambiguous. So let me take one very fabulously, I think, fascinating case from the African case, and that is the relationship between Islam and Voodoo. One of the most fascinating examples of the ambiguous boundaries defining Islam among Afro-Caribbean peoples comes from Haiti. On an August night in 1791, at an alleged, perhaps apocryphal, secret meeting of fellow slaves in Saint-Domingue's Bois Caiman forest, that Bois Caiman alligator forest, the religious and political leader Boukman purportedly held a Vodou ceremony which, as the narrative goes, launched the Haitian Revolution. The representation of Boukman as a Haitian Vodou priest is pervasive, but Boukman had another, not as well-known identity. He is thought to have been a Muslim also. The few historical records that exist suggest that he was an English-speaking Jamaican brought to Saint-Domingue, the future Haiti, by a British slaver. Some scholars suggest that Boukman was also an imam. The name Boukman is thought to be the French pronunciation of his nickname in English, Bookman. He was called this because he was alleged to be literate and purportedly owned a copy of a particular book. You might guess what that book is, the Quran, right? So emblematic of the Bois Caiman ceremony, as it is told in oral histories and traditions passed down many, many generations in Haiti, was, as historian Laurent Dubois reports, an oath of secrecy and revenge that was taken in this Bois Caiman ceremony. It was allegedly sealed by the sacrifice of a pig, which is typically portrayed in later paintings as a black pig. And we're going to get to these paintings in a minute. Other kinds of associations overlap in the revolution narrative. Cécile Fatiman, Boukman's contemporary, is thought to have been Muslim, and the famous slave revolt leader, Makandal, who preceded Boukman, is portrayed as an African Muslim, adept in the use of Islam-derived magical amulets. In fact, Makandal's name eventually became identified in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, with various kinds of power objects, poisoning, power objects poisoning, sorcery, I beg your pardon, and slave dances. Vodou priests and Vodou talisman came to be known there as Makandals, and a person who possessed certain powers and practiced Vodou was thought to be a Makandal. So you can see all of the semantic variations on this one figure and how they become integrated into a thought process about the relationship between Islam, resistance, Haitian Revolution, and Vodou. A few years ago, I made a preliminary research trip to Haiti to inquire about Islam there. Oops, I missed my own pink highlighter. Where is okay. Now it's time for, as promised, the paintings, but I don't know what to do. Help. Sorry. I'm very old school, as you can see. No PowerPoint. Thank you. And then I just keep going with that. Thank you. Sure. Now these pictures, which I just took off the internet. I did not take them, but they are, of course, you would understand, are paintings. We'll see some photographs later in the other example I'll talk about. But for now, I think some of the artists' renditions of Boukman are very fascinating. And we're not projecting them only to the audience because they're under copyright, I'm sure, or at least some of them are, and they are not my paintings, so that's why you're looking at me, so you all just get to see me on the video and not the images. But the audience, you guys can see them because this is a different context, so it's fine. And so here is a these are all late 20th century artists' renditions of, and you can find them yourselves very easily on the internet. And I think it's interesting to show you the different imagery that is invoked. So here he is with his conch shell calling out the announcement, and he's got his saber or his sword, his machete, his cutlass, whatever word you want to use, to suggest revolution and resistance. And he's, he looks in pretty good shape, and he's clearly a heroic figure of masculine virility and competence, and honor. And Boukman is very, very well respected, and we can't say enough about his honored place as the hero for a free Haiti, right? And so, but then there's more. I wanted to show you three other ones. It's the same imagery, or same story, I beg your pardon, same story, but with different imagery. So on the far left, you have the celebration and presumably the oath that's taken that promising that you will join in this revolutionary moment. And you have the, I don't know who the lady would be. I think she's there for, visual interest. But that would be Boukman. And there is, of course, the proverbial black pig that's sacrificed. And then in the center, another artist's rendition, and that is that's the black pig and the sacrifice of this. And then I think the third one is really interesting because this one, the person who's got his arms up like this is undoubtedly Boukman, and he's dressed much more like an imam might be. Again, we can only guess. I don't know, there's no captions that go with these, but these are, as I said, all 21st century or late 20th century, 21st century depictions by artists, perhaps Haitian artists, likely. And I just wanted to show the different ways that he is celebrated and has a central role. But he can either be, some Haitians are not too excited about giving Boukman his imam and Muslim dimensions, and others think it's absolutely integral to understanding him. And so, of course, the question is, what is the relationship between Islam and Voodoo, and how does it define Islam? So, I think, is there another one? Yeah, there's him again. It's the larger picture, so we can keep that there for a minute. Well, actually, let's keep that there. A few years ago, I made a preliminary research trip to Haiti to inquire about Islam there. There is as yet no exact agreed-upon numbers for Haiti's Muslim population, but in 2009, the Pew Resource Center's study estimated that Haiti had about 2,000 Muslims, and in 2013, the Arab News estimated that there were 4,000 to 5,000 Muslims in Haiti. Many are self-taught converts who, as part of the Haitian diaspora, embraced Islam while abroad in North America. They were primarily men, as far as I could tell from being there. I can't say that definitively. I met mostly men who had emigrated to the U.S. and Canada during the Francois Duvalier or Papa Doc regime that ran from 1957 to 1971. Oops. Well, I'll pick that up later. Where was I? So many are self-taught, as I said, that was part of the Haitian diaspora. And they had returned after the regime was over in the 1970s and 1980s, after converting to Islam in connection with the North American Muslims that they met during their sojourns. And Islam also became more widespread after the January 2010 earthquake, when some Islamic relief groups and religious missions and UN peacekeepers from Muslim countries were in Haiti, offering aid, proselytizing, and seeking places for their own worship. So during conversations I had with my Haitian Muslim interlocutors, the subject often turned to the relationship between Islam and Voodoo. They turned to this subject and what Islam and Voodoo mean for Haitian identity. Among the issues that stood out during my visit were the ways that Muslim Haitians' profound sense of self as Haitian shapes their understandings of the meeting ground of Islam and Voodoo. One domain in which this particularly came through was in their historiography of the Haitian Revolution. The revolution represents a moment of unproblematically multi-layered spiritual and divine inspiration, where Haiti is the unique result, the repository that allegedly encapsulates Islam, Africa, and Voodoo. That said, a number of the Haitian Muslims with whom I spoke offered some interesting revisions of key aspects of the revolution narrative, which suggested a felt need to emphasize Islam's role in it, particularly given Vodou's preeminence as a defining feature of what it means to be Haitian. One variation, I was told, was that the forest was not called Bois Caiman, but rather Bois Kai Imam, meaning the forest by the Imam's house. That it was not a ceremony that was held in Bois Caiman, but a khutbah, or public sermon. That the suggested date of the Bois Caiman ceremony in 1791 was Eid al-Adha, the Feast of the Sacrifice. That it was a lamb and not a pig that was sacrificed at Bois Caiman, because a pig would make too much noise in that clandestine moment. Very logical thinking. That the pig, which the Boukman story specifies as being black in color, was really white, a metaphor symbolizing the French colonial oppressors. And finally, that the word voodoo, or vaudou, comes from the word wudu, Arabic for the ablutions in preparation for prayer. These were all variations on this foundational imagery. One Haitian imam explained that, quote, "We don't have too many scholars in Haiti to travel for Islamic knowledge. We are a bunch of brothers and sisters who have accepted Islam without all the skills and knowledge, but we have faith and we have our African traditions, so we feel more attracted to Islam." The African traditions to which he was referring live in Vodou rather than being either specifically racialized or inimical to Islam. In many Haitian Muslims' point of view, Vodou is the fertile ground in which Islam takes root. Rather than perceiving Haiti as a place that needs Islam to improve it, Haiti was presented to me as particularly ideal for Islam, a place where Islam could flourish, a place to which Islam is logically suited. So one might perhaps call this a Haitian nationalist Islam, where local cultural history is not eclipsed by or in competition with religion, but instead is central to it. This perspective is shaped by the monumental importance of the Haitian Revolution in the Haitian popular imagination, and by the motivation on the part of Haitians to reclaim their history from the colonizers' versions that silence alternative pasts. These reclamation narratives, as I call them, are infused with Haitian nationalism and a commitment to counter colonial historiography with pre-colonial and otherworldly origins. They seek to recapture the histories of Pepla, the people, the masses, rather than purify them into a single cohesive canon, that is, orthodoxy. In other words, there's a Haitian reason to reclaim themselves, in a sense, rather than motivation from orthodox doctrine or canons. And this Haitianness is not fundamentally defined through race, although it highlights Haitians' African heritage. Let me quickly get to the last of the examples. Islam among Afro-Caribbean peoples diminished significantly by the mid-19th century, and most historians accept this. This was largely due to absorption by Afro-Atlantic religious traditions that belonged to the vastly greater population numbers of Afro-Caribbean peoples. By 1838, slavery in the British Caribbean had been abolished, and a new system of labor exploitation, indenture, brought 438,000 Indians from India to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations through a binding contract. About 14% of these were Muslim. The majority of the laborers were sent to what was then British Guiana, although today Guyana, and to Trinidad. The traffic in indentured laborers did not end until 1917, which is, as you know, very late. Although in practice the indenture system was not much of an improvement in the treatment of plantation labor, in legal terms, indenture was meant to look very different from slavery. One of the ways that the British could convey this was to protect, remember that word protect? What's protect mean and who's a member of society? One of the ways that the British could convey this was to protect the religious freedoms of indentured Indians. That was one of the ways that the British could say, yes, we are these moral leaders of the advanced world, right? This covered a range of issues, from what kinds of religious rituals Indians could be allowed to conduct on the plantations, always a fraught question, to the more personal concerns. For example, Trinidad's acting governor in 1908, Governor S.W. Knaggs, sent a letter on June 19th of that year to the June 9th, of that year, to the Earl of Crewe, the Lord Privy Seal and Secretary of State for the Colonies, to ask how Muslim prisoners should be treated in connection with the prison rules of the colony. And particularly, Governor Knaggs was interested in how far Mohammedan, as he put it, prisoners should be exempt from the rule requiring the hair and beard of all male prisoners be cut on being admitted to prison. And they were putting a lot of indentured laborers in prison, let me tell you. That's a whole nother story. He noted in his letter that he had consulted the Executive Council, who advised him to follow the lead of the prisons in India. They really don't know what to do about Muslims in this context, because remember, they have to protect religious rights. So Governor Knaggs sought further guidance. Muslim prisoners customarily had been treated, as he says in his letter, with some degree of difference on the ground of his religion. But, he says, doubts had arisen about the necessity for making such a distinction. In other words, do we still need to be bothered with attempting the basically, public relations image of the British moral superiority by not cutting these Muslim prisoners' beards? Do we still really need to do that? That's what he's asking. Although there were only 9 years left before Britain's indenture scheme would end, officials were still grappling with how to define and recognize Islam. That is, how to put it to use in the context of crime and punishment, which was controlling labor and sustaining plantation production. In this example, channeled through the bodies of Muslim men, Islam becomes a kind of watchdog category for the rules of imperial control. In religious rituals as well, British colonials used Islam as a kind of watchdog category. Certainly the most significant public ritual in the Indo-Caribbean, still active today in Trinidad and Jamaica, is Hosay, H-O-S-A-Y. Hosay's complex geographical path began as Muharram, the annual mourning ritual associated with Shia Islam in the broader Persianate world that commemorates the deaths of Hassan and Hussein, hence Hosay, grandsons of the Prophet Muhammad, who were martyred at the Battle of Karbala in present-day Iraq in 680 AD. Centuries of Muharram's observance in India drew in Sunni Muslims, Hindus, and numerous others as participants. So Muharram's characteristic heterogeneity in India remained in its version as Hosay in the West Indies. There, the confluence of Muslim and Hindu indentured laborers and Africans belonging to Christian and Afro-Atlantic religious traditions constituted Hosay's avid participants, with Hindus, and this is not a small point, still comprising the majority of Hosay's devotees, Hindus. Hosay's signature activity was and remains constructing enormous tajas or tazias that symbolize the tombs of the martyred brothers and publicly marching them in procession for each of the final 3 days of Ashura, that is the last 10 days of the month of Muharram. Balanced between, on the one hand, Victorians' post-emancipation position that, at least in principle, religious freedom be fostered in British colonies, and on the other hand, the demand of plantation sugar production, Jose was variously given and denied legal and cultural status as religion and as Islam. Contemporary debates in the West Indies about Jose center on its criticism by competing schools of Islamic thought that look to orthodoxy based on the Quran and the Hadith, and who object to Jose because they say, there is no Jose in the Quran and the Hadith, so this is not really Muslim. This is contemporary Muslim criticism. And also there are those who object to what they see as the carnival atmosphere of this commemoration. But others, Muslims included, celebrate Jose either as a symbol of resistance to oppression, rejection of planters and plantation societies wish to curtail their activities and their movements and their rights as members of the society. Or they celebrate the fact that, today Jose is touted as being a kind of symbol of the multicultural tolerance of modern nations. So some scholars comment that the popularity of Jose in the Caribbean is bewildering, given that over 80% of indentured laborers were Hindu, and of the Muslim indentured laborers, over 90% were Sunni, not Shia. Again, I'm just trying to layer on various kinds of complications and really, I think, fascinating ambiguities that continuously, for hundreds of years, pose a challenge as to what the nature of this so-called object is that we are trying to define and handle. Because after all, much of the concern with Muslims and Islam historically, as we've seen and today, is really about how to handle them, either as participants in resistance, rebellious leaders, as I said, fifth columns, or external terrorists. So, yet, as Caribbean Muslims who have maintained Jose for many generations and participated and avidly contend, they say that it is authentically an Islamic observance with an Islamic genealogy associated with it, the grandsons of the Prophet Muhammad, and Islamic doctrine in the form of ritual. There are important Muslim rituals connected to Jose. And other Muslims don't agree. So let's just look at what we're talking about here. Oh, there's Makandal, just to show you, being commemorated. Again, the machete or the cutlass is a symbol of revolution here. There, as we see, this is from the early 20th century, the tajas, which, as I said, are the tombs, representations of the tombs of the two martyrs, Hassan and Hussein. And you can see that they are gorgeous and very tall. There's the people, they're much taller than the people. Later in the 20th century, they become wider and shorter because they kept knocking down the phone lines. But until they had phone lines, they could be very tall. So there's one picture of it, and then I want you to see, there are the so-called coolie laborers, lined up for a photograph, but probably fresh off the ship, ready to be contracted, not sold, but as I said, in practice, quite similar, and sent to various plantations. This one is from Trinidad, but you have these photos from Guyana as well. And this I wanted to show you today. This is Jose today. As you can see, we saw this early depiction. Well, here it is today. And you can see where the concern would come from the fete-like atmosphere, the carnival-like atmosphere. This is St. James, this is Trinidad and Porto, Spain. And there are two main centers where Jose takes place in Trinidad today, St. James in the north and Cedros to the south. And these, you can see the tajas are enormous and they're absolutely stunning. But, some critics say they look, a little reminiscent of carnival floats, right? And that the behavior is not pious around them. Whereas, again, Muslims who participate in this say, we can't control the crowd. We only can talk about our own devotion. So I just want to end here by saying that rather than taking Islam as a given object of analysis, that belongs to a site or location that is precisely defined by self-evident, fixed historical or cultural boundaries, what Talal Asad called a fixed cast of dramatis personae, we can approach the study of Islam as a subject of analysis that takes its shape and substance from the vicissitudes of history and the unpredictability of cultural formations. We can give greater priority to vernacular forms of Islam as more or less provocative variations of a doctrinal touchstone, rather than measuring Islamic belief and practice in a particular place and time against a litmus test of canonical authenticity. Islam is not a frozen thing. It is conditional to the shifting authorization of certain beliefs and practices, which can either celebrate or diverge from particular schools of thought. We can bear this in mind outside of perspectives, and I think we should bear this in mind outside of perspectives that tend to see power relations among Muslims toward themselves and toward others as contentious and violence-driven. One alternative approach is to explore local histories and expressions of religious doctrine within relations of power that are experienced in the context of everyday life. And I will end on that, and thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. Thank you. And I will also hand it over to Dr. Caraballo Resto. Thank you. Before, there's an earring on it. That's okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So thank you so much for such a timely, nuanced, and provocative presentation. Let me just... Thank you so much for such a timely, nuanced, and provocative presentation, which certainly challenges essentialist views of Islam, showing how this religious tradition continually engages with local and global issues of culture, gender, class, race, and power. As it is the case with many other parts, we in Puerto Rico, we're going through dire moments. And at this time, our financial crisis is deepened by the political disregard of sexual and ethno-religious minorities. So this is why I think it is pertinent for me to comment your great work by further contextualizing it in the contemporary Puerto Rican horizon. Your presentation, Aisha, fosters a better appreciation of the ways in which Islam becomes as well as is. As Muslims, however they may be defined, bring Islam to bear on assertions of personhood, contestations of personhood, and the construction of this religious tradition as it serves community-building projects. In this light, I think it is important to say that Islam's relationship with Puerto Rico consists not of mutually exclusive categories hypothetically repelling each other, but a relationship of interlacing encounters. And it could be argued that there are 6 pivotal junctures that help transform the presence of Muslims in the island, which nowadays is estimated around the heavily debated figure of 5,000 people. Evidently, these junctures are much more complex, porous, and at times even simultaneous, but they help sketch a broad landscape of the diverse and prolonged Muslim presence in the island. Muslims, as Dr. Khan suggested and explained earlier in her presentation, Muslims came to this region, but specifically to this island, as part of the transatlantic colonial exchange between Spain and Portugal and the New World. There is evidence that the first Muslims arrived with the explorers in the 16th century, Many Moriscos or Iberian Muslims came to the Caribbean by passing Spanish laws that prohibited them from coming to the Americas and serving as merchants, slaves, and explorers. Thanks to the work of Aurelio Tanodi, we know of the arrival of one Moor who boarded the ship Santa Maria de la Merced and arrived in San Juan on the 15th of May in 1516. Equally important, thanks to the work of Salvador Brau, we know that ever since 1519, Puerto Rico had the dubious distinction to host Alonso Manso, the first general inquisitor of the Spanish kingdom in the New Spain. Furthermore, thanks to the work of Francisco Moscoso, we know of Anton Cobo, one of the first Moriscos identified in the island, just as Francisco de Aguilar, then mayor of San Juan, asked his deputy to document for information on all the Moriscos living in the city and the island in 1549. Moreover, thanks to the illustrious work of Luce López Baralt, we know that there is even a count of anti-Morisco processes between un Morisco puertorriqueño, médico, alcalde de San Juan de Puerto Rico en pleitos con Juan Ponce de León, which serves as a title to one of her articles on this issue. The second juncture, which you discussed at length, is made up of men and women who were forced into slaves from West Africa, predominantly from Wolof, Mandinga, and Fulani groups coming from the Senegambia region. Though these enslaved Muslim communities barely thrived in Puerto Rico, they established Islam in significant ways across the island's cultural fabric. De ahí que nos venga el conocido refrán, el que no tiene dinga, tiene mandinga. While many of these enslaved communities faded due to forced and or conditioned conversions to Catholicism, beyond Puerto Rico, however, Islam did become the second monotheistic religion in the Americas. According to Sylviane Diouf, this was due in part to the religious imagination and inventive ritualistic adaptation of enslaved Muslims, former slaves, and Maroons. The third junction is characterized by the arrival of Arab migrants, mostly Lebanese, during the 19th century. And although some of these families were Muslims, they were also Christians. However, the religious difference did not mean the cancellation of important cooperation links between them. Most well off and positioned themselves into livestock industry, jewelry, and medicine. Surnames such as Bechara, Halabi, Bared, Fas, Tartak, and Mameri resonate with relevance still to this day in our island. The fourth juncture corresponds to the arrival of Arab migrants who settled in the island since 1950. And this migratory wave was mainly constituted by Palestinian and Jordanian men who fled the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, seeking better life and closer ties with the United States. Along with them, Egyptians, Syrians, and more Lebanese also arrived. Their economic profile was average, and in this time, the itinerant Arab sellers burst into our streets. This migratory stage has been maintained and currently corresponds to a strong circular migration. And above all, their new generations have developed here in the island. The fifth juncture corresponds to the sons and daughters of these migrants who extend their migration status of their parents and their grandparents by one or two generations. And while they may have been born in Puerto Rico, the circular migration patterns of their parents keep them in close contact with the Middle East. Together with their parents and grandparents, they largely comprise today's Muslim communities in the island. In fact, nearly 2/3 of Puerto Rico's Muslim population is made up of Palestinian immigrants, predominantly concentrating in places like Caguas, Vega Alta, Vega Baja, Dorado, Manatí, and San Juan. The sixth juncture, which is one I would like to focus on, corresponds to a growing Puerto Rican population that has embraced Islam. Although the beginning of this stage is not clear, there has been a sustained increase since the 1990s, and it should be noted that this juncture deserves special attention as it has an important diasporic element that, in my view, deserves its own focused analysis. Now, Dr. Khan talked about the need to explore local histories and expressions of religious doctrine or within relations of power that are experienced in the context of everyday life. In this light, I would like to share some preliminary findings that are to be contextualized in an ongoing research where I discuss salient identity practices of Puerto Rican Muslim converts. In particular, the information that I'll share with you this afternoon further enhances Dr. Khan's presentation. It is based on participant observation, virtual ethnography, and interviews within and with a diverse cohort of Puerto Rican converts, which contains a wide gradation of interlocutors that range from feminist activists and people with strong theological weight to people who are involved in interfaith action, business owners, social workers, teachers, students, former inmates, as well as one who recently broke fresh ground within Puerto Rico's partisan politics. So I would like to share some of these salient practices that I've been able to co-create with my interlocutors. First, Puerto Rican Muslims who convert to Islam share common experiences with immigrant Muslims when it comes to living their religion in a predominantly non-Muslim society that is not entirely accommodating to, or at least knowledgeable of, Islamic lifestyles. Much of the everyday experience of converts is unique to them, however, in that they are recurrently over-questioned in either the Puerto Rican mainstream or Arab/Muslim migrant communities. Zainab, a 42-year-old convert who embraced Islam 12 years ago, told me that the most distinctive feeling she has about being Puerto Rican and Muslim is not fitting in, coupled with the consequent loneliness, and in her usual self-assured tone she expressed. Uno se siente que constantemente le están recordando lo que no es. Uno no es como el mainstream puertorriqueño. Casi nadie aquí piensa en nosotros cuando hablan de Puerto Rico, pero con los árabes es igual. Una es la nueva, a la que le falta un montón para hacerlo bien, como ellos. Y esto constantemente. Un machaqueo constante y a veces una se ve sola. Y eso no te lo dicen cuando te conviertes. El día de la shahada, or the confession of faith, todo es hermoso. Después es que te das cuenta que nadie en la mezquita piensa en nosotros como musulmanes. O sea, como iguales, como gente con una voz y con dones que aportar en los asuntos de la umma. Es más, si me pongo a contar todas las veces que he ido y ni el khutbah traducen, end quote. Many interlocutors express that as time passed, they felt more and more strongly that they did not fit in any category. As the intensity of the conversion mellows, converts become aware of the new social role they find themselves in and realize the new parameters that surround them. What has been most appalling to so many of the people I have been in contact with, especially women who don the headscarf, has been being taken as a foreigner in the Caribbean society that grew up incomfortably, and hence losing the feeling that they totally belonged to it. For example, Mariam, a woman in her mid-30s who embraced Islam 5 years ago, commented, "Todo cambió el día que me puse el hijab. No fue el día que hice shahada. Yo esperé un tiempo para aprender, educarme, pensar cómo todo se estaba generando. Y cuando finalmente decidí dar el paso de ponérmelo, el hijab, a partir de ahí, para la gente fui otra persona. Era como si ya no fuese puertorriqueña. La gente me miraba con una cara y empezaban a cuchichear como si uno no los pudiese entender. Mira, una vez fui a Walgreens y cuando fui a pagar, la cajera no sabía qué hacer conmigo. Un repelillo y me hablaba en inglés. Yo le tuve que decir, corazón, yo soy de Naranjito. According to Mariam, this happens because people think she is a foreigner. She wears large headscarves and very little makeup. At times, she also wears visible henna designs in her hands. While some in Puerto Rico may imagine or associate these as signs of distinct fashioning of the self that correlates with a foreign culture, among Arab Muslims, especially within the group context of the mosque, such signs are interpreted somewhat differently, albeit not conducive to the complete erasure of differentiation. According to some of the men and women I have been in conversation with, the embodiment of Islam is a very much contested terrain. In this regard, Yaqub, a middle-aged new Muslim from the metropolitan area, expressed how difficult it was for him to make sense of Islam, his process of conversion, and the newly embraced community he was welcomed into. At one point of our conversation, perhaps because some of our engagements had taken place around national holidays, he alluded to the ways in which some of the Muslim men at the mosque oriented him with regards to Puerto Rican festivities and holidays. He expressed, yo hice shahada en septiembre, y como tú sabes, hay muchas celebraciones para esos meses. Halloween, Acción de Gracias, Navidad, que desde Halloween se está celebrando aquí. Pues un día estoy hablando con algunos hermanos después del Jumá, o Friday Prayer, y empiezan a criticar muchas cosas de Puerto Rico, el alcohol, la bebelata, la falta de valores. La cuestión es que uno de ellos comentó que cuando su hijo llegó a la adolescencia se lo llevó para Jordania porque aquí no iba a aprender bien el árabe, ni cómo ser buen musulmán, que si se iba a perder. Bueno, se lo llevaron. El asunto es que en la conversación me empiezan a explicar que ellos sabían que yo era converso y que habían unas cosas que yo tenía que cambiar y que ahora como musulmán las cosas tenían que ser distintas. Yo eso lo sé. Por eso es que abrazo el Islam. Pero de momento yo esperando que me dijeran algo importante del Islam, realmente islámico, pues no. Empiezan a decirme que yo no puedo participar de ninguna fiesta con mi familia, amistades, que la Navidad ya no puede ser algo que yo celebre porque hay demasiada música, fiesta. Me quedé con la boca abierta. Me sentí como el hijo al que mandaron al Mediano Oriente. En aquel momento no les dije nada, pero tenía la cabeza a millón. O sea, para ser un buen musulmán, tengo que darle la espalda a mi cultura y ser como ellos. ¿Dónde en el Corán aparecen todos esos disparates? Ellos confunden Islam con cultura. Y como uno no es árabe, siempre te ven como un niño. Y ellos te exigen cosas que primero no son islámicas, no tienen nada que ver con el Islam. Son cosas que de su cultura, que te las quieren endilgar. Y como uno acaba de llegar y no sabe, te confunden. Es difícil. El Islam y mi puertorriqueñidad no están en pelea. El Islam es un mensaje para toda persona. Yo soy mejor puertorriqueño por el Islam. Yo estoy claro en eso. Se puede ser musulmán y puertorriqueño a la vez. Yaqub alludes to a sort of Arab centrism that many other interviewers were critical of. His comparison between the young man sent to the Middle East and the way he felt when engaging in dialogue with Arab migrants is telling. Both stand as references where Muslim-majority contexts in Arab geographies are deemed as moral beacons of correction. This is due first to the strong link that exists between Muhammad as prophet, his divine revelations, the Arabic language, and the geographies that he, along with the first Muslims, inhabited. Second, Arab-centric ways are also due to the strong attachment that many Muslim migrants have with their emissary societies as home. And third, it is also a way of counteracting the negative stereotypes that make up popular discourses about Islam and Muslims in Puerto Rico, especially when engaging with Puerto Ricans. Yaqub is not alone in his critique. Many interlocutors also resented el arabocentrismo that is often experienced by them. It was not unusual to encounter terms like musulmanes de segunda as a means to qualify their feelings of being downgraded ad infinitum, or musulmachos as a means to qualify through a gendered lens those whom they identify as the generators of such uneven relations of power within the Muslim communities in the island. Inasmuch as the everyday experience of my interlocutors educes a feeling of recurrent over-questioning in either the Puerto Rican mainstream or in Arab Muslim migrant communities, I have identified being Muslim while remaining Puerto Rican as a salient identity practice within this group. The second one that I would like to share is one that I have named Puerto Rican Muslims Making Space for Themselves. In view of the power dynamics I just presented, many of the Muslim converts I engaged with, particularly those whose conversion exceeds the first 2 years, purposely chose to omit common projects with already established mosques that are controlled by Muslim migrants. Conversely, it is not unusual for them to make use of their homes as central places of prayer and worship, both at personal and communal scales. I have actually been invited to some prayers, including that of iftar, or the breaking of the fast during Ramadan, in people's homes. I also attended Eid with a group of converts at a park, as opposed to the usual mosques or convention centers where most Muslims congregate for this festivity. This is not to suggest that most converts never set a foot inside a mosque, but when this happens, it tends to be in specific moments, and many commented on the mental and spiritual preparation this requires of them beforehand. Equally important, education projects represent another area that many of the people I interviewed find important in their quest to make space for themselves. Just as so many have stopped seeing the environment of the mosque as one that is conducive to inclusive worship, they have found the didactic initiatives that usually take place in these spaces as being equally inadequate for them. Consequently, very few have actually attended schools and seminars abroad, while many have turned to alternative platforms such as self-teaching initiatives. And in this regard, Nicole, a Muslim convert who has chosen to keep her birth name, doesn't wear a headscarf, and despite having converted 7 years ago, has only set a foot for the first time in a mosque last summer, expressed. Yo tengo mente propia. No puedo bregar cuando alguien me dice lo que tengo que saber, sin antes permitirme la posibilidad de construirme desde mi proceso, de preguntar, de investigar, de reflexionar, de dudar. La duda es importante. Yo siento que las dudas constantes, la incertidumbre, es algo que nos caracteriza a los conversos y a las conversas. El estar confundido es maravilloso, porque eso quiere decir que soy yo y no otro quien está pensando y conociendo. Las dudas nos empoderan. Perhaps it was no surprise to have been invited by Nicole to her home a couple of months ago during one of her cleaning sprees. She complained to have hoarded books and asked me if I would be interested in inheriting bits and pieces of her library. I couldn't resist. As she brought carts filled with books for me to evaluate, she said, "Ahí hay un montón de libros sobre conversos, pero ya me los leí todos y me los conozco, no los necesito. También hay muchas biografías de Mahoma. Estoy conservando algunas que no quiero dejar ir, pero este año vienen más, así que tengo que hacerles espacio." That day, I left her home with 3 full boxes that contained more than 40 gifted books that irremediably fed my book hoarding habits. As I drove home, I reflected on the importance of our interaction and her gifting. All of a sudden, I found myself not only with new books, what I now held were at least 40 instances of empowerment for Nicole. These books represented profound journeys of doubt and self-education in a context where such transforming endeavors are lived so privately. Others, however, are less intimate. All of the people I interviewed resort to the internet as well as social media as important outlets of knowledge and empowerment. This is so as they help democratize both knowledge as well as the process through which it is constructed and legitimized. People choose, follow, connect, and disconnect. Some have even gone on to fashion themselves as voices to be recognized/contested via YouTube and Facebook. The third salient practice I would like to highlight is the raising of children as Puerto Rican and Muslim. While only 6 of the people I have interviewed have had small children, the ways in which they explained their parenting context is important for my work. In different ways, these parents express that they spend most of their emotional and intellectual energies raising their children to feel comfortable as Puerto Ricans and Muslims. They are often frustrated, however, when teachers, neighbors, and/or acquaintances accuse them of raising their children with another culture and even language. Khadija, a mother of 2, expressed, "Para mí el Islam es un camino, no una cultura, y no puedo enseñarle a mis hijos una cultura que no conozco. En nuestra casa somos boricuas, se respira, se escucha y se come Puerto Rico." Yet, converts have other hurdles too. Just as it is the case with those who recurrently find themselves over-questioned in either the Puerto Rican mainstream or Arab/Muslim migrant communities, their children are not exempt from this rebounding alterity. It is thus not surprising to learn that just as adults have devised self-teaching initiatives for themselves, they have also produced independent efforts for their children through provisional home schools where converts take turns devising material, developing lessons, and facilitating them to their children. The fourth and last salient practice that I would like to share pertains to finding Islam in Puerto Rican histories. In Puerto Rico, it is seldom spoken of the 6 junctures that I presented at the beginning, or all of the histories and trajectories that Dr. Khan so graciously shared with us earlier on. This is why, upon finding of these joint trajectories, some Puerto Rican converts find an important tool with which to contest traditional tripartite discourse of Puerto Rican history and identity as being solely characterized by Spanish, Catholic, African, and indigenous characteristics, as well as to contest Arab-centric domains that ignore that while there may be new Puerto Rican Muslims, Islam did not arrive with contemporary waves of migration from the Middle East. In fact, it has been a reality, even if silenced, since the very creation of the Puerto Rican nation. It is in this regard that some interviewees make sense of their conversations as decolonial acts of sovereignty. This is so as their ongoing processes entail divesting from dominant structures of power within the Puerto Rican mainstream and Arab Muslim migrant communities that interrogate them as unfit or inadequate. They are able to accomplish this in part through the research, learning, and retelling of Puerto Rico's very own multifaceted Muslim presence, one that colonizing projects have silenced. To conclude, today, as we pose the question Islam in the Caribbean or Caribbean Islam, it is also important for us to explore Islam in Puerto Rico and the degrees to which that also suggests Islam of Puerto Rico, its multiple creations as an object of study, its modes of expression in local vernacular terms, and its development over time and space. While I do not want to suggest that these four are the only salient practices, they sure help better understand an important part of the dynamic of the practices. They sure help better understand an important part of the dynamic Muslim presence that inhabits Puerto Rico. The idea is to explore simultaneously lived experiences and the ways these experiences are inscribed into our own subject matters, by both participants and observers in Muslim minority societies. Rather than a simplistic nativist approach that only focuses on Puerto Rican Muslims, I propose that it is this totum revolutum, that which currently represents our Islam, the Islam of Puerto Rico. Perhaps the time is ripe for us all as researchers, activists, Puerto Rican and migrant Muslims to respond louder to Talal Assad's calling, not only by challenging the stereotypical and allegedly adversarial dichotomies of Islam's patriarchy, terrorism, destructive discord, parochialism, traditionalism, and foreign character versus Puerto Rico's apparent gender equality, national democracy, recent and much delayed forms of protest, modernity, and its inherently native ways, but furthermore, in aiding our population to recognize itself in its ethno-religious diversity. Thank you. So, yeah, we would like to open the floor for questions and comments. If there's anyone who would like to pose the first.
This is a very exciting topic. I've always been interested. I teach literature in the English department here. And I've always been interested in why, in the study of Caribbean literature, there has been very little attention paid to the presence of Islam in the culture, in the language, what do you call it, the words, a lot of the words that are used, in the dress code. I come from Ghana, West Africa, and I know the connection between West Africa and the Caribbean, going back to pre-Columbian days, and also West Africa and Europe, pre-Columbian days. And my question is, I'm happy that in your presentation you talked about localizing the religion rather than forcing yourself to become an outsider within your own local culture, your own local place. The spirituality.
Try to understand the religion as local peoples.
As local peoples.
I'm sorry, to try to understand the religion as local peoples in a particular historical context and social context practice it. Yeah, there shouldn't, I don't really mean to say any more shoulds than that. Yeah.
And I'm interested in suggesting that right now, have you looked at contemporary, 21st century Caribbean writers who are actually producing literary narratives and poetry that recognize the presence, the historical presence of Islam in the Caribbean and the Islamized Caribbean. I'm thinking of, what's her name? Rian Shah of Guyana. She has 3 novels. There is a Muslim convert also in Guyana, and there are several, there is Flanagan's novel, Islam in the Islands, and in that particular novel, there is that whole debate whether Islam came with West Africans or Islam is just an Asian thing. And that depends on the kind of history that has been taught to people in the Caribbean about Islam. So I was wondering whether you could look into those texts also.
Well, I think that taking the position that Islam only has South Asian provenience in the Caribbean is missing the first, 250 years of Caribbean history. So I'll be interested to see if how this is a debate that continues, because I think the debates, as in my understanding, are really about which of these variations constitutes the most authentic Islam. Again, debates undertaken by the various practitioners. So, and that's a matter of perspective and point of view. As far as the literature, the fiction literature goes, what's interesting is to think about how these contemporary authors are construing a kind of retrospective in their work. Unfortunately, my most acute acquaintance with thinking about Muslims in the Caribbean in literary terms is V.S. Naipaul, and he's got his issues. So we'll leave that there. But maybe later at another point, I'd love to hear your ideas about what these Rian Shan, other contemporary authors are what kinds of statements they're making in their imagery and evocations of Muslims. Is it celebratory? As I said, one of our two choices, we've got good Muslim, bad Muslim, and so I would wonder how maybe they're in a certain kind of political mission, maybe a laudatory political mission, simplifying and repeating the dichotomy that I'm suggesting, we try to not fall into again. But that said, fiction and the imagination is not the same thing as ethnography, and so it's representing what. Well, let me put it another way. Both ethnographers and fiction writers represent what people do, but from very different kinds of positions. So it would be I hope that you put together a panel that invites ethnographers and authors of fiction and poetry to talk about representing Muslims in various ways. That's a really interesting point.
Oh, just one more point. I realized there were Muslims in St. Croix and the U.S. Virgin Islands when I was doing research on the effects of Hurricane Hugo. Mm-hmm. I did not know there was a large presence of Muslims there. Mm-hmm. So for me, that was exciting to know that.
And they were from where?
Mostly Palestinian, Arab Muslims, and then they have several businesses, etc., etc. But my research was on the effects of Hugo on the U.S. Virgin Islands. Mm-hmm. And for me, doing the research to find that, yes, they have their voices. They participated in the narratives of poverty, etc., etc. For me, that was very exciting. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering whether, because Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, whether you could cross over to see connections.
There have been moments where men and families who have been leading mosques here in Puerto Rico, as, for example, an imam, they would go to St. Croix particularly to establish or to further enhance the capacities of certain communities, whether that is providing their services as imam for a limited period of time, or creating or further enhancing lessons of Arabic, for example, for the Muslim communities scattered in the Virgin Islands. However, that I know of, there isn't as much exchange or porosity as one would expect with our neighboring islands, when we know for a fact that there are so many other Puerto Ricans that do travel and migrate between these islands, or they do establish themselves. So, to my knowledge, it has been very punctual efforts that have been made at very particular times, and not that I'm aware of at this moment. But now that you mentioned, for example, Hurricane Hugo, I think it will be interesting to also look how Muslim communities also organize themselves after Maria to contribute to our further development here in the island, whether that was through Islamic Relief or other international NGOs, or just distributing materials and food and clothes and water locally here in the island. So that's something that definitely deserves a closer look.
I'll just add really quickly that Hugo, Maria, we saw this, as I just touched on, in Haiti in 2010. And that becomes a massive moment of possibility as Islamic Relief and everything that I listed creates a renewed space.
Any other question? First here, and then we can go to.
I'm going to risk resetting the United States again, but I have to ask the Ilhan Omar question. What have you heard about her from Muslims in the Caribbean? I think I can imagine folks here like her. Have you heard anything from Muslim communities about Representative Omar? You're not hearing. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, have you heard what have you heard from Muslims in the Caribbean about her and her performances in Congress?
Among the communities and populations I work with, there's very, very careful narratives. There are very careful narratives about race. There are very careful narratives about gender. There are very careful narratives about politically sensitive issues, especially as regards the global north. And so I think that the question, the answer would be, one, what is who are you talking with, and what's the situation that you're talking? How close are you with this person? And how really invested are they in North American politics, in U.S. politics, in this rather, its implications for Muslims in the U.S. is not. I think the implications are not as profound as special registration was, right, under the Bush administration. So there are degrees of impact that is perceived, and that, I think, influences the kinds of conversations that happen and whether they happen at all. So I personally have not heard anything except oblique references of U.S. injustice as in decrying what she's saying, right? But very oblique, very careful for many reasons, not only, including that the communities that I work with are always, as I said, about race, about gender. There's careful language, because talk is incendiary. Words are dangerous, right? Whether it's your next door neighbor or whether it's, being overheard by the local, alderman or whatever. So I would say that until her profile becomes perceived as more impactful on Muslim lives in the U.S. or in Canada, I think it's more of a vehicle about the ability to critique the U.S. in general, U.S. policies in general, with regard to that part of the world, Palestine, Israel, etc., and also treatment of minority populations in the U.S. That's.
Well, from my end here, it's not a topic that I have really heard much about. I remember one or two women talking about it with expectation, as Aisha was just saying. Let's be watchful of how she portrays herself and what she actually does. I think that has a lot to do with our own local politics and the fact that in this current government there were so many women also in the governor's cabinet, for example, or within the legislature, and people are just prone to be in this moment of our histories somewhat cautious and even cynical at times. So there's just expectation. Obviously there is a sense of accomplishment that, you know, there's a woman who's Muslim and who actually made it, but then let's wait and see who is this woman and what she actually does, or the policies that she pushes forth. But again, I think overall it hasn't been a topic that I have heard much about. That doesn't mean that it is not addressed or talked about in much more complicated and nuanced ways.
Thanks again for hosting this panel. Well, I just want to say thanks again for hosting this panel. It's a little bit difficult for me because you're right here and you can hear me just fine without the microphone, but I guess because of the whole pickup question. Well, okay. All right. Two questions, actually. The first one is, so you mentioned one example of the Trinidadian sort of Islamic-based festival that they have in, you didn't mention at what time of the year, but I'm assuming.
The last 3 days of the last 10 days of the month of Muharram, Ashura.
Okay.
So, but that's calendrical, so you can't say it's, you know, December 25th, Christmas Day.
Gotcha.
You can't-
For those of us who are very bad at calendar math, we're just.
Well, you got to look for the moon. I mean, that's part of the argument is, do we need to keep looking for the moon, or can we be more quote unquote modern? I mean, that's a whole nother strand of the argument.
Sure. The question just being, what are some other examples of adapted Caribbean, in particular in the Caribbean, if even more particular within Puerto Rico, of festivals that have, at least in part, Islamic traditions either brought over from, well, I guess in Puerto Rico's case in particular, largely from the influence of sub-Saharan African migrations, to put it gently. Is there any other examples of that we can look at?
Well, I will let Juan take the Puerto Rico part of the question, but the first, you know, again, as an anthropologist, you always have to start with, you know, let's deconstruct the question first. And I would say that, you know, part of the tensions within and debates within Islamic scholarship among Muslims themselves is the nature of the worship practice, right? So you have very Spartan modes of observance, and you have, you know, that decry, say, Sufi exuberance, right? You have, you know, variations of what kinds of ritual observance should be made and how they should be done. So the and so, for example, even you have the Muharram in Persia, in Iran today, which has self-flagellation and lots of crying and other kinds of bodily expressiveness that doesn't really make it in India very long, right? There's, you know, because of there's more of a Sunni influence and also non-Muslim, right, influence. So even Muharram takes on different dimensions or different expressions in the old world. So then you have to then you would ask yourself, well, who brought the Islam here? That we can still recognize historically, because, you know, clearly, you know, Islam came with free. You know, I like to always emphasize, not all Africans came to the New World as enslaved, right? The majority, perhaps, but, you know, we don't really recognize Islamic practices from enslaved or free Africans because of the length of time that's passed. I would say that probably you would find it in music, right? But that may be more African, but certainly percussion is a Muslim, you know, a Muslim expression in many Muslim cultures around the world, the importance of percussion, even if other kinds of musical developments are not, you know, center stage, no pun intended. So I would say, I would ask a musicologist about musics and particularly percussion influences and how they resonate with what we, again, you have to account for hundreds of years. What did the music sound like for the Africans who came over when they came over, whether it was, 15, whether it was with Hernan Cortez or in 1812, right? So I would say that what we do then have within historical memory is South Asian or Indian traditions. And again, because Islam is kind of Spartan in its expression among the folks who came here, lots of text, reading the Quran, lots of prayer. There are qasidas or songs that are sung, that are hymns, basically, just like bhajans for the Hindus. It's spiritual or sacred music sung. But these are not diffused within the wider culture. They're contained as certain kinds of ethnic or religious experiences. So I would say that, except for, and Jose even itself sort of, seeping out into the larger society, yes and no, as you can, imagine, if it's held at a certain time of year and it is at least intended to be connected to Islam and therefore contained, it is a problem when it seeps out of its Islamic confinements, right, definitions. So that's always going to be not something that a culture embraces wholeheartedly. So I would say that, it's a long-winded, anthropologically long-winded answer to, to say, let's look for other, that is a great, endeavor, but I'm not sure, you would find this, it depends on how widespread you mean in the culture and how you were defining it as Muslim and by what mode of recognition, right? Factoring in hundreds of years or factoring in disagreements among Muslims themselves. Well, no, that's not a Muslim tradition, as we saw with Jose. So, I'm sorry.
So so that leads actually perfectly into the second question that I had, which was, and I thought it was brought up kind of accidentally perfectly by the question about Representative Omar, because Representative Omar represents a relatively, at least as far as her immigration background is concerned, part of the Muslim world that we're not really talking about when we talk about Puerto Rican Muslims in large, right? The ones that are immigrants that come here rather than the ones that convert. And so the follow-on question following on to that thread is what you were referring to earlier about these traditions that some immigrants bring over that are like, oh yes, this is the correct Arab way to do this, but really that has nothing to do with the religion itself, and this clash over identitarian politics and what it means to be one thing or another. How does that, when we look at the large, and this is a heck of a question, you can interpret it whichever way you'd like, but when we look at the sort of larger arc of what would be Islamic migration into Puerto Rico, and I guess into the Spanish Empire in general, what other traditions can we point out? Because a lot of folks always point out percussion as this like, yes, this can also be, this is not only African, but this is also Islamic. And where do we draw the line between, no, this is something that we can say is uniquely Islamic, or something that we can say is uniquely from these cultures in this particular area or this particular region of the world, and where do we say, throw our hands up and say, well, at that point in time, people weren't really drawing the boxes as neatly as we're drawing them now, and really it's a task in futility to attempt to do so. Like what are some traditions that overlap that, that because of a lack of written traditions or I suppose a concerted effort to keep people from maintaining a written tradition, do we see the influence of African or sub-Saharan African Muslims wane as a result, in comparison to South Asian Muslims, as a result of that, indentured and slavery division, meaning that South Asians could get potentially a chance to become literate and not be flogged or punished for attempting to maintain one.
Yeah, even in, I think, 1956, Kelvin Singh did a study where something like, 54% of Indo-Trinidadians were still not literate long after World War II. So they're not so literate. but that's, as you know, that's not the only way a tradition is perpetuated.
Right, but so that melding of things that were considered, African roots in Puerto Rican culture and things that are also considered to be Islamic roots in Puerto Rican culture, one could argue that that has a root in that oral traditions not being very good at saying, oh yes, this came from, great-great-granduncle so-and-so, and he was doing this specifically because he was of this religion or this ethnic group, and so on.
I think there are two parts to the answer. One is you're asking the wrong person in terms that I'm not a Muslim myself. I'm not a part of this community. So when you ask where do we draw the line, it is not upon me to draw these lines. It is not upon me to normalize these circumstances or to structure them. So you would have to go to the communities yourself and pose these questions and see how they respond to you, if they respond to you at all. Then from this other side, I have also found that some women in particular have been very active in looking for these histories coming from West Africa particularly, and seeing how particular sheikh figures have been key in questioning the Arab migrations coming from the north in the 13th and 14th centuries, and how that paved the way for other sheikh figures such as, for example, Amadou Bamba, to structure or at least create new theologies, and that is used as a source of inspiration to contest all these Arab-centric patterns that they themselves have identified within their own communities. So I think that's important to say. It is not a majority of the people that I have talked about, but it is interesting that it's mostly women that I've engaged with in these conversations. Now, going to your other questions about the festivals, Luce Lopez Baralt has done an extensive work trying to at least interrogate what are some of our current festivities, particularly those surrounding key moments or key events in the Christian calendar, such as Christmas, for example. And she has interrogated the role that food plays in the ways that Christmas is celebrated here in the island, and how the pig is so central, not only central but magnificent during the time of Christmas, and the role that Spanish histories and contentions may have played in the construction of these traditions, the ways in which they have been altered, debated, or sustained, or cooked even throughout the centuries. So I definitely encourage you to visit her work. She not only talks about the ways in which pork is cooked and displayed, but also the ways in which dairy products such as milk for coffee is prepared in so many Puerto Rican homes throughout history, and how there, in so many households, it is identified that there is like a small pot that is only used for heating up the milk of the coffee, or just for boiling eggs. At the very most, maybe cooking oatmeal, but that's it. And she's interrogating, where are these traditions coming from, and what do they say about our identities as a nation? There's this saying of "you are what you eat." So who are we when we eat what we eat, how we eat it, and how we prepare it?
Thank you both.
I would like to add that's very interesting when you mentioned that tradition, how to boil, which pot to use. I'm a Muslim and I'm a Palestinian Muslim. So yes, I boil eggs in a special pot. I don't use that for boiling, for example, milk or anything. It's just special. So maybe there are like links or something, because here I'm a PhD student now in literatures, and also an RA for Professor Posada. She's a linguistic a professor, so she asked me to look into Arab communities, since I am an Arab, a Palestinian Arab, how they retain language, because she's a linguist. So I've been like reading through a lot, and I read some articles you wrote. It is very interesting because with the Spanish Inquisition, Arabs came here, slaves, Islam spread. The thing is, I've noticed with this student is that they associate religion with ethnicity, like Islam and then Africa. Like there is a difference between religion and a certain type of ethnicity or people. But just I was just making a comment and talking also about pigs. How, Dr. Aisha, how does the pig in that picture fit in as a celebration, maybe an Adha celebration, where when as a Muslim we don't eat it? It's like prohibited. How, like, why the pig was chosen, for example? So it raises a question about the identity of
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's the delicious mystery, because remember, these depictions are meant to focus on voodoo,
Yes.
and non-Muslim Haitians, like non-Muslim Puerto Ricans, don't have any problem eating pork, right? I mean, it's a delicious meal. So these representations are a kind of, maybe we can say, pastiche or syncretism, where you have the predominant depiction is certainly from Vodou, and it's certainly about Boukman, the Ungan, or the Vodou priest, right? And that's why I think the painting that I showed on the far right was particularly interesting, because he seems to look much more Islamic in his representation, certainly more than the one on the far left, or the first one I showed. But again, it's speculative. But of course, may I say, an observant Muslim would not be sympathetic to these renditions and would say, well, the pig wouldn't be, as you say, just put in such a prized position. Moreover, as I have, when I've written and published about this in much more detail, the question also is, what kind of a Muslim is, I didn't mention this because it didn't want to go on too long. Part of the alleged ritual was sacrificing the pig and then drinking the pig's blood, that everybody has to, and so my question is, what kind of a Muslim is going to drink animal blood? No, not, So this is a kind of very fluid oral tradition that clearly in these depictions, these are not Muslim artists, right?
Yeah.
But Haitian Muslim, as you heard from some of the brief passages that I quoted, deal with them in different ways. Well, it wasn't a pig, it was a lamb. So that's that problem solved. Or it was, maybe it was a pig, but it wasn't a black pig, it was a white pig because we could kill it, because that's anti-French colonialism. So these, as an anthropologist, these are the kinds of interpretations that we get up in the morning for. So that's what I would say. Either you deny it, one would deny it altogether and say, well, this is not our tradition. I don't, Boukman, whatever he carried around in his pocket, we don't care. This is not proper. This is not Islam. I mean, gosh, that's said about Jose, which has a lot more clear provenience than the Bois Caiman assembly. But you can either deny it or reject it, or you can make variations on the pig theme, which is so fascinating, because then you get, it's like having your cake and eating it too. You can, you know, acknowledge I'm a Haitian, because it's very important. I'm Haitian, I'm not Haitian, but to be Haitian, and that can never be severed from Vodou, you know, but I'm also a very devout Muslim, so how do I make my peace with that, so to speak?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yes, I do not understand the difference between a Shia and a Sunni. And I would like to know what the difference is and which type of Islam do they practice in the Caribbean. That's a question. And the other thing is, in Trinidad, some years ago, I don't know whether it was in the 80s or 90s, there was a small group that was leader by Abu Bakr, something like that.
The Jamaat al-Muslimin.
And he took over the parliament. And,
1991.
And stayed there for some months or some weeks, something like that. Could you, but they were not Indians. They were African Trinidadians, right? I would like for you to...
For the most part, I'll answer both questions as quickly as I can, and then maybe Juan, if you have something to add. The Jose story is intimately connected to the Shia-Sunni division. As the story goes, and I'm not a theologian, but this is how I understand the story. When the Prophet Muhammad passed away, there were wars of succession. Who was going to assume the leadership? And there were two basic camps or schools of thought, and they were fighting, and one side lost, and that side became Shia, and they had their various practices, which are not that different, by the way, than Sunni, and the other side were Sunni. And so that's why you have in present-day Iran, as they say, the Persianate world, you have primarily Shia Islam, but in other parts of Asia and Africa, primarily, not 100%, but primarily Sunni Islam. And so and that includes in India. Except, of course, Jose, thrives in India for hundreds of years, although, as I mentioned, as I touched on, changed a little bit, given all the Hindu influence and all the Sunni influence, and other, tribal peoples perhaps participated in it. And so when Jose comes to the Caribbean, or it's Muharram in India anyway, but when it comes to the Caribbean and becomes Jose, it has gosh, I don't want to go on. It's so fascinating. It's a long story. Even scholars today they debate, how Shia is Jose and what is the Shia genealogy, and I'm one of the contenders that says it's not very important that that the Jose may have started out as the Shia mourning ritual. Maybe I didn't say that again. I only have a certain amount of time. But the Muharram is the mourning, M-O-U-R-N, the mourning of the martyrdom of Hussein and Hassan in these caliphate wars of succession. So it's a very sad commemoration, right? And so this roots of it isn't as central when it comes to the Caribbean, partly because we don't really know how many Shia were among the Muslims who came on the ships as indentured laborers, right? And minimal, probably, from everything else that transpires. And also, you have to ask yourself, why would, any kind of ethnic or religious or racial, whatever, identification has to have a particular significance. It has to have a certain set of stakes in a given moment. And there were no stakes in the Caribbean to assert one's Shia-ness. Today, it's quite in ways that I can't take the time. It's in my book that I just finished. So don't worry, don't be alarmed. I'm not going to go on and on about that. But there are different claims to a heightened Shia profile in Jose, but they're for very contemporary political reasons. And by political, I don't mean bad. I just mean they have contemporary political motivations. So that's the Shia and Sunni difference. And your other question, I can answer that quickly.
They took over
Oh, yes, and that was, yes, Imam Abu Bakr, who had Jamaat al-Muslimin, which was a kind of a mosque compound, and they were primarily Afro-Trinidadian, but not only. There were Indo-Trinidadian Muslims there as well, and I think that was part of the something that they were interested in emphasizing. That we are not exclusive, we are not racial, unlike the British colonizers, unlike the Euro-Christians, we are not racial. So the majority were Afro-Trinidadian, but not exclusively. And I also want to underscore that, yes, what they did in the coup attempt was, very serious, but their platform was as much about social justice and reparations as it was about a certain kind of Islam and fostering a certain kind of Islamic presence. I would say that Islam was their conductor, their conduit to really talking about social change in terms of justice and fairness and equality in resource distribution and opportunity. They did have a very clear, I'm not, reading this in, they had a clear reformist political agenda. So that also contributed to the idea that we're not exclusively racial.
I would just like to add that in Puerto Rico in contemporary times, most of the communities have a Sunni self-identity, placed identity, and this has a lot to do with the nationalities that make up most of the communities here, which, as I mentioned, were mainly Palestinian or Palestinian Jordanian, and because of the proximity of these two nations with Saudi Arabia, there is a lot of politico-economic relationship, and Saudi Arabia recurrently tries to hamper down the establishment or the proliferation of Shia groups within the Middle East, particularly in Jordan and Palestine. So that is not to say that there haven't been any Shiites here in Puerto Rico. As a matter of fact, in recent times, there has been a small Ahmadiyya community that established itself, I would say, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago. So this whole plethora of differences and diversity keeps on growing here in Puerto Rico. And just to add one more point of complexity to this, there is also a Sufi group that is well established here as well in the island, and that just opens a whole different Pandora box. So, but just to be mindful of the fact that they are also within the island. So I guess we're out of time already, and I would like to thank Dr. Aisha Khan for being such a great host and presenter. We hope to welcome you again, and thank you all for coming.
Yes.
Thank you.
Second, to thank you all for wonderful questions and for your patience and for being here with us. I really appreciate it, and I know you do as well. Thank you.
Thank you.